Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Power Up Your Databases. This event is part of the Power Up Your Databases webinar series. This is a 7-part series brought to you by Nutanix and produced by Actual Tech Media. In this 5th episode in the 7-part series, you'll be learning about the MS SQL Server workout, how to become a database powerhouse without the heavy lifting. We've got a great event lined up for you today. Before I introduce you to today's expert presenters, first, there's a few things that you should know about the event. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media. I'll be serving as the moderator, and we want this to be an educational event. So we encourage questions there in the questions box. It's on the left-hand side of your audience console, and I can call your attention to it now. Of course, we appreciate all the good morning, good afternoon messages from around the world and across the United States. Thank you for those. We love the Actual Tech Media audience out there. We also want your technical questions, though. We want to hear your challenges as it relates to running databases on premises and in the cloud. We want to help you to solve your problems. So bring those questions there into the questions box as they come to mind, and we'll be doing a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We also have a link there in the handouts tab to the Nutanix Era test drive. This is a free test drive that you can take completely in your web browser, no obligation, easy to use, and we'll be talking about that later in the event, but I encourage you to check out that link. And then finally, if you're watching this event live, we will be announcing the winner of a Visa $300 gift card at the end of today's presentation. So make sure that you stay tuned for that. If you're watching this on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found in the handouts tab. And with that, I'm excited to introduce you to today's expert presenters. They are Mr. Mike McGee, Technical Marketing Engineer at Nutanix, and Mr. David Teague, Technical Marketing Engineer also at Nutanix. Mike and David, it's really great having you both on the event today. I've seen a preview of your content. We also hope to do a live demo, so exciting stuff. I'll first hand it over to you, Mike. Mike, take it away.
David, thank you so much for having us, and thanks everyone for joining us, both live and if you happen to catch this on demand later. We really appreciate your time. And like David mentioned, we're going to give you a Microsoft SQL Server workout from the Nutanix perspective. And we'd like to give you really our views on the common concerns that we hear from you all. So our prospects that are out there, our existing customers, myself as being a DBA in the past, there's generally a common set of concerns, of considerations, of things you're trying to address across your SQL Server environments. And really it starts from the ground up. It starts from your infrastructure all the way through the presentation tier of your application. Some of the most common concerns around that are things like security. Again, both security from things like data at rest encryption all the way through the network traffic that might be able to reach different tiers within your environment or even different production environments or test and development. It could be performance related. And again, performance could be anywhere really within that entire stack. It could be down to the storage devices that you're leveraging, the amount of compute and memory that you've assigned to a given SQL Server instance, to the bandwidth and the networking that you have coming into the system, all the way through, again, a presentation layer and an application layer above that. At the same time, you want to make sure it's not only performant, but also highly available. There's various ways in which you can create a highly available environment using native tools within SQL Server, using infrastructure-based tools, hypervisor-based abilities. We'll talk about that. Also, a lot of that ties into disaster recovery as well. If you're using something for HA, if it's a separate copy, you might even be able to use that within data centers at different distances for DR. While you're doing all this, you're trying to maintain a reasonable cost, not only with respect to what you're spending on the infrastructure, your hypervisor, your networking components, your application, but also your licensing for SQL Server as a whole. So we'll touch on that and how we can help you there as well. And even further, when you are making multiple copies for the purpose of disaster recovery or backup, you might also be leveraging those for testing, which again tie into performance, for example. If you're writing transact SQL statements and you want to be able to test them and use existing data to really get an idea of how well they're going to perform, you're going to want to use production data as close to production as possible. So how do you get efficient copies that are highly performant where you can do that level of testing, and how can Nutanix help? All the while, you want to work across these common concerns and make sure that the solution is simple. We're finding more and more that you have different administrators in environments. You're asked to do more with less. You might be a DBA, asked to work with a hypervisor. You might be an infrastructure admin or a storage administrator, asked to work through the hypervisor networking or even up to a DBA level. So how can we make things very simple, predictable, consistent, that really anyone can implement what we're talking about at the end of the day? So that's really what we're going to focus on and where Nutanix can help. With Nutanix, if you're not familiar, we do start with hyperconverged infrastructure or HCI. If you're not familiar with HCI, the idea is that you're taking what is typically disparate systems between servers, a storage area network, storage systems, the virtualization layer, maybe even the networking layer at top of rack, and combining that into one simple consolidated software-defined platform. So for Nutanix, you might hear us say HCI, you might hear us talk about AOS, which is our core operating environment. It's our software-defined capability to really collapse all these layers and allow you to run it anywhere. And what I mean by anywhere is you can run it on your hardware of choice. So we have our own appliance, but you can also choose HP servers, Dell servers, Lenovo servers, and so on to help you, based on your requirements. How much storage do I need? What's my compute profile? What kind of networking do I need? What virtualization layer do I want to leverage? You can use ESXi with Nutanix. You can also use our own native hypervisor and call it AHV. You can even use something like Hyper-V. So we call it Hypervisor Agnostic HCI. But you can consider platform agnostic. So you might have heard recently we've announced something called Nutanix clusters, and that's our ability to run our software not only on your hardware vendor of choice, but also your cloud of choice. So imagine taking our environment and running it on bare metal, for example, running in AWS, for example. And we also recently announced in the future, we're going to allow you to do that in Azure as well. So now, not only are you getting a hypervisor agnostic HCI solution, you're also getting a cloud agnostic solution as well, whether it's your on-premises enterprise cloud or one of the public cloud hyperscalers that you've come to know between AWS, Azure, and others in the future. But to get down into some of the features that we can offer, really starting from the perspective of HCI and how we can help you with your databases like Microsoft SQL Server. So because we're a node-based architecture, a scale-out architecture, one of the things that we like to do is something called data locality. So that's when you instantiate a new database, instantiate a new virtual machine, you would place it onto one of the compute nodes, x86 servers, bare metal server in the cloud, running our software. The internal storage local to that node can be optimized. And that's what we refer to data locality. So if you have an application that's writing locally, we're going to keep a copy of that data local to the node and replicate it to any other any other node within that particular cluster. And that's true whether it's a 3-node cluster or a 32-node cluster or even more. We have customers running with 40 plus nodes, 50 nodes, et cetera, in some parts of their environment. So write data locally, distribute across the node for the purposes of high availability of the data. But then when your database goes to retrieve that data, they're going to retrieve the local copy. So we're going to prevent the need to go traverse the network, go to another node, go to the top of rack switch for that particular virtual machine, which helps you both with respect to random workloads. It's going to give you lower latency for that given database. For the experience of a write, again, writing locally and one copy remotely, it's going to be fast, especially for things like the transaction log. You're going to want that to be, if not 1 millisecond, even the microseconds in some cases. But also with respect to not only random reads, but sequential reads. How do I get the best bandwidth without having to go over the network, top of rack switch, and utilize essentially local bus speeds for something like an NVMe drive, or even something like 3D XPoint, so you get the best throughput, the lowest response time, and so on. So data locality is core to our platform, and it's going to give you the best performance. It's also going to help us when we later talk about linear scalability. In most environments, you just don't have one database or one virtual machine hosting a database. You're likely going to have an environment where you're running multiple copies. It could be different copies for test, dev, and so on. It could be other databases that might be ancillary to different applications, to different parts of the business, but you might want to run it on a common cluster. So you get inherent QoS also from this capability. Nodes because they're localizing data, you're going to have less of an impact to other nodes running different applications, different databases running on the same cluster. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Working in concert with data locality is our native tiering. So again, because we have a software-defined solution, we don't care what technology you have within a given cluster. We have the concept of heterogeneous clusters, meaning that you can right-size specific nodes with the right amount of storage or compute, and that can actually live in the same cluster as other node types that might be less compute dense, more storage dense, and so on. So if you were co-mingling a web tier, an application tier, business logic layer, along with the database, you can actually mix that in the same common cluster and right-size the nodes for those given purposes. So you could have nodes that are all flash, all SSD. They could be hybrid nodes that have a combination of NVMe and SSD, or even hybrid nodes that have a combination of SSD and hard disk drive. Now, when you leverage our platform, not only are we tiering the data with respect to data locality, we're also tiering it across a platform with the device type in mind. So imagine a tiering algorithm that takes local high performance storage as a first class candidate. Secondly, remote high performance storage, again, SSD and NVMe. Third, local hard disk drive or more of a capacity tier of storage. And lastly, remote hard disk drive. So our platform is always optimizing to keep the hottest data local and on the highest performing tier, and the coldest data, if not local, remote and on the slowest performing tier. That helps you not only from a transactional perspective, again, similar to data locality, making sure things are in SSD and NVMe, that when you do log writes, it's always going to land on the fastest performing tier as initial response times require, but also from a throughput perspective, ensuring that the highest tier is getting that hot data to feed the application to make sure you have the most throughput that you can have. So by combining these technologies, the data locality as well as the tiering, local first, remote second, high performance first, low performance second, it really gives us a clear understanding of if we add a given node type, we're likely going to be adding a known envelope of performance, both with respect to compute, but also performance from a storage perspective for your SQL Server transactions. And the graph you see here is actually a third-party validation of scaling out a SQL Server environment one node at a time by adding additional instances, virtual machines, if you will, of Microsoft SQL Server. And you can see as we add additional nodes, 1 instance, 2 instance, 3 instance, 4 instances, we're adding a linear scalability based on that known envelope as we scale additional virtual machines, additional SQL Server instances on other nodes. So whether it's from a transactions per second, just the raw number of transactions, or the response time, seconds per transaction, you're getting a very consistent experience just based on the linear performance capabilities of the core platform. So we know we can scale out with our platform very simply. You can add another node really at any time. We have algorithms to help balance data as it's consumed in the system. So very much like cloud-like agility, you can start small and incrementally scale, add a node, add a node, add a node, linear scale as you go, as you add additional applications. But we can also get to a point where we can scale up these nodes as well. So if you have very large monolithic databases, terabytes in size, petabytes in size, we can absolutely support that. If you have a high core requirement for a given individual virtual machine, or even maybe a bare metal instance that you have out there, or a lot of storage requirement within a particular node, or even just a high amount of memory, we offer node types across our hardware portfolio. If you're curious what we offer, we have something we call the dynamic spec sheet. Highly recommend you check it out. You can choose different platforms and understand what's our node density with respect to the networking we offer, the SSD, HDD, NVMe type, how dense can these nodes get, how much memory can I put in them, and also the total number of cores. So if you need a very dense SQL Server environment from a scaling up perspective, we can get you there as well with our core offerings. Now we talked about data locality and the ability to scale up a node and keeping data local to the node, but there are some scenarios, very, very high throughput, very, very high number of IOPS requirements in given environments where we might want to scale out the IO. And this is where we can take an individual virtual machine, or again, even a bare metal server running outside of the platform, and have it leverage directly the storage and all the nodes concurrently from a compute perspective. All the nodes are always leveraged for the storage pool, but what we're talking about here is leveraging multiple what we call controllers on each one of our nodes in parallel for the exact same workload. And there's a few ways in which we can allow that. One way is through the use of something we call Nutanix volumes. That's our ability to export the storage across all of the nodes within a given cluster. Again, this could be a 32 node cluster. All 32 nodes can present iSCSI sessions to external servers for that purpose. But we also have something unique with our own hypervisor called AHV, and this is what we call direct attached volume groups. So this is where you can take a logical construct of a group of LUNs, virtual disks, if you will, attach it to a particular virtual machine, and then tell the system, you know what, instead of hosting all those locally to this node, go ahead and spread them out across all the nodes because I need more bandwidth than this one node can provide, perhaps, or more likely is I need direct access to all the NVMe or SSD across these nodes because I have a very IOPS hungry database. So we can control whether you want to localize everything within one node or actually spread it around and localize it across multiple nodes with direct access through this construct called a volume group. So we talked about scaling up. This gives us the capability of scaling out for an individual, very large monolithic VM or bare metal server to get the most throughput in IOPS based on your requirements. So we talked a bit about how we manage things as a platform. So really talking from the infrastructure side up, and we're going to begin to move up the stack and start to a little bit more about what we can offer with respect to other applications that we offer, as well as what we can do with virtualization and our hypervisor. And one of the key benefits of virtualization, again, whether you're leveraging ESXi, whether you want to use our hypervisor AHV, is the ability to consolidate. So if you have a mixed environment today, even if it's all virtualized, by going to a consolidated HCI platform, you have the ability to start to right size your environment, whether it's consolidating multiple SQL Server instances into a single virtual machine to help with licensing, consolidating different versions, going to a faster processor speed to reduce the number of cores you might need to provide the same performance. But really, it gives you the ability to consolidate based on your core requirements. Also, by having things like intelligent data protection, but also things like enhanced data reduction capabilities built into the platform, things like erasure coding, things like native inline compression. You get that regardless of the licensing level, the SQL Server version that you happen to be using. I know 2008 and 2008 R2 are end of life, but there's people that still use them today based on legacy applications that have those for hard requirements, whether you're 2012 all the way through 2016, 2017, et cetera. Different licensing level and different versions give you different capabilities. So with the core platform that gives you compression regardless of the version or essentially the SQL Server edition that you're running. You also have HA options regardless. When you're leveraging something like virtualization, you're going to be able to live migrate, have VM HA across the nodes. Again, whether you're doing something like always on availability groups, failover cluster instances, or just simple virtualization. Because we do offer our own hypervisor, this is included with the platform. There's not a separate licensing cost for virtualization. So if you're looking for a virtualization solution that's not a separate charge that's built into the system, AHV is great for that as well. Fully functional, gives you all the capabilities that you need to really consolidate based on those capabilities that we talked about before, having built-in HA, built-in performance optimization, dynamic resource scheduling, and so on. And just to give you a customer example of one of Nutanix customers that really took what I just discussed to heart. They had an environment with 7 different SQL Server versions. You can see the different editions there between Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, all the way from 2008 to 2016. So different operating systems, hundreds of instances, sometimes across hundreds of virtual machines. So a very disparate, separated environment and a very large number of total vCPUs committed. And using vCPUs for your licensing, that's going to lead to a lot of cost and also a lot of management headache. How do I keep all these up to date and patched? And how consistent are these implementations? Are they all deployed the same way? Or some deployed differently? Are they matching the best practices of a given platform? So a very wild environment that's very difficult to manage and likely more cost prohibitive if it weren't otherwise consolidated. So they went through a sizing exercise and were able to consolidate this environment all the way down to 30 total vCPUs. So consolidating multiple instances onto common virtual machines, reducing the number of not only SQL Server versions, but also Windows operating system versions onto what they refer to as hotels to make it much more efficient and much more simple. In their particular environment, you can see they did end up with some 2008 R2 still sticking around. And David is going to give us a demo a little bit later on ways in which we can help you finalizing or getting past that last piece of migration, moving from something like 2008 R2, and how do I get that existing database over to maybe a 2016 or higher version of Microsoft SQL Server. So I mentioned before the ability to scale out the workload and really, again, around cost and consolidation. In some environments, you're using physical instances today. We run into a lot of customers that have an existing SQL Server database, and the hardware on the server side is relatively new, but maybe the storage on the SAN side it's due to refresh. For you storage administrators out there, you might have a disparate refresh cycle between your servers and the underlying storage. So one of the things we can offer as a part of our virtualization platform, like I mentioned, is something called Nutanix volumes. And again, that's how we export storage to bare metal servers for various purposes over via iSCSI, so that you can replace something like a SAN, continue to leverage the investment that you have in those specific servers. And then when you're ready to virtualize, when you're ready to consolidate those bare metal instances, once they come off maintenance or you no longer need them, you'll then be able to virtualize those onto the same platform and even do it without moving data because it's already on Nutanix as a whole. So that's one of the benefits to continue to utilize existing hardware. Another one is just simply right sizing. If you have physical servers, they're perfectly fitted and matched for a particular application. You're going to license all the cores within those hosts. There's no sense in virtualizing and necessarily having to license an entire environment for HA purposes. You can really, again, leverage that existing hardware and also right-size the physical hardware separate from the storage side of the equation or even the HCI side of the equation to make sure that you're matching your requirements. So again, your licensing is going to be optimized for that purpose as well. And similar to leveraging bare metal instances, there's another feature that we can offer you around databases, and this is what we call compute-only nodes. So again, if you have a particular database where you want to leverage every core within that node strictly for processing of the database, not only from a transactional perspective, but an IO perspective, and separate out the Nutanix controllers onto the HCI platform, you can leverage AHV for the virtualization piece, but separate out the storage piece to be managed by the rest of that AHV cluster. So all the licensing that you pay for on that particular node with respect to CPU are only going to be leveraged and used by the database application. Not only that, we can also allow you to leverage certain node types that you might already have. So if you have compute nodes that match our HCL, if you will, you'd be able to leverage them again, use them with our virtualization solution AHV and add them as compute-only nodes within our AHV cluster as a whole. So again, you're really leveraging existing hardware in some cases, you're optimizing for licensing, ensuring the database gets all that compute power, and you're making it very, very easy to manage. Unlike Nutanix volumes, which could be a Windows operating system, for example, configuring iSCSI to connect to the underlying storage, it's relatively simple. But with AHV compute-only nodes, you don't manage any of that. You're simply installing your virtual machines, and we take care of the storage underneath the cover. So making it, again, like I was saying early, very easy, whether you're a DBA, a network admin, virtualization admin, or storage admin. So that's how we help you with optimizing for cost across those various areas. Now let's talk a bit about simplifying high availability and disaster recovery. So again, because we're leveraging virtualization core to the platform, when you do virtualize a database, take something that's bare metal today and bring it down to being a virtual machine, you're going to get inherent benefits. You're going to get high availability, you're going to get live migration, you're going to be able to move things around, preventative maintenance, and so on. We have quite a few customers that actually are failover cluster instances today. They have shared storage. They want to move away from the complexity of doing shared storage, and by simply moving it to virtualization, they're getting the HA that they want by being able to move VMs between nodes, either on demand or if there is a failure, restart in the event of an HA event. Now, not everyone wants to make that level of a change. If you're doing, for example, database patching or OS patching, and you're worried if something goes wrong with the database patch, if something goes wrong with the OS patch, how do I remediate that failure? Or I don't want to be offline at all if something goes wrong. So many customers continue to leverage failover cluster instances, shared storage for SQL Server failover clustering. We can certainly support that today, again, both from a bare metal perspective or even virtual machines running on different nodes on the same platform. So across hypervisor offerings, you can run failover cluster instances with shared storage and continue to operate based on that model. Do patching on one instance, run the application on the other instance. If something were to go wrong, you'd still have HA at the application layer. But many customers have moved on from FCI and started to look at things more like always-on availability groups, where you actually maintain multiple copies of a database on different nodes within either the same platform or even different platforms, different data centers across different regions to give you not only HA in some cases, but also core disaster recovery. So we can support that as well. It's actually very fitting to our platform as a whole. Again, going back to data locality, if you had a primary database running on a very very high-end compute-centric node, gives you all the production performance that you need. But maybe you have a secondary copy running on another node, not as performance, but maybe you're performant, but maybe you're using it for some kind of lower priority reporting as a read intent offload copy, or maybe you're using it as backup offload, and so on. So again, you can right size the nodes on which the primary copy runs on, secondary, and so forth, and so on, and whether they're running on different clusters and different data centers to give you disaster recovery as a part of giving you HA with those multiple copies. And when it does come to disaster recovery and data protection, we want to give you flexible options. And every environment's a little bit different. Some folks like to leverage native application-centric disaster recovery capabilities. Old school SQL, a lot of people use log shipping. Maybe you're doing some kind of merge or transactional replication, or maybe you are most commonly using always-on availability groups to give you different copies of the database across regions so you can do disaster recovery either sync or async. But we also have customers that, based on their hypervisor of choice, might be doing some form of replication at the vDisk level. And we also offer native synchronous, near sync, and async replication as a part of our core platform. Near sync meaning you can get down to 1 minute continuous replication. Sync meaning true sync replication. If it's committed in the secondary site, it's going to be committed there first before being acknowledged back to the primary site. And async meaning 1 hour or higher type of RPO. So depending on the recovery point objective that you need, we have you covered. And one of the benefits of having an infrastructure-focused capability of doing that is you can have a consistent method regardless of application. I know we're focusing on SQL Server. SQL Server has native methods, but you might be an infrastructure admin and you might have hundreds of other applications with some with varying levels of ability to do native disaster recovery and replication. By having a core platform that can do that replication for you and also give you recovery services, runbook automation, and so on, you now have a consistent method for doing disaster recovery regardless of whether it's just SQL Server or maybe a suite of applications or even the entire stack related to that SQL Server database. Your presentation layer, your business logic layer or application tier of the application, which might be stateless. It might not be stateless. You could be using remote blobs that could be in a file server somewhere, something Nutanix also offers, something called Nutanix files. So all those layers of the application you can represent consistently across the board, dependent right consistent within a consistency group, controlling the writes as they go, as a single unit that can be recovered at a remote site. So, again, we have you covered whether you're running native replication, hypervisor based, or if you want to use our centralized services on the core platform. And finally and quickly, we'll talk about security. I mentioned security earlier across the entire stack. So whether it's at the infrastructure layer where we give you security technical implementation guides built right into the hypervisor, built right into our platform, so you're secure out of the gate with these known STIGs. But it could be all the way through to the application on the networking side. So we offer native microsegmentation built into our AHV hypervisor. Again, if you have different presentation tiers, application tiers within a given SQL Server environment, you can choose to firewall them off with a stateful firewall as a part of this microsegmentation vertically. And you can also segment horizontally. So if you have different environments, maybe one is for test, one is for development, one is for production, you can make sure that you're not allowing things to cross those different environments should they not be required. Or even if you find a vulnerability, you can start to block these different environments from each other based on this microsegmentation to really harden the overall environment based on your requirements. And lastly, the other piece of security is standardization. So how do I create a model where I'm consistently deploying a database, deploying an operating system, and ensuring that it's consistent, it's hardened, it's got the correct patches, it's got the correct versions, and it's going to give you the full capabilities, not only from security, but best practices tied in as a known entity. So we have several offerings that we can give to you around self-service and also database as a service to give you that consistency in deployment to help with standardization of your not only your deployments but also your patching and day two operations. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David Teague, and he's going to help step you through what we can offer specifically at the database layer as a database as a service with Nutanix Era. David?
Yep, great. Thanks a lot, Mike. As Mike mentioned, we're going to talk about Nutanix Era. If you don't know what that is our essentially our database as a service offering. It is designed for your database admins. So their console is the idea is that they would be able to access it directly, and they would use it there. We do basically database lifecycle management from provisioning all the way through now to patching, and deprovisioning because you know what you have installed. So anything that you install with Era, of course, you can keep track of it. And real quick though, the great thing about Era though, it does take advantage of all the native stuff that the Nutanix HCI platform brings. So when we get to this discussion about talking about restoring from doing a restore from a backup, it's actually using the Nutanix snapshot. So it will restore even multi-terabyte databases within 10 or 15 minutes because it's all local to that node where it's restoring where that database is. So it can help in the event of a disaster, would definitely help you get back online quicker. And so this is kind of the four things or pillars, you want to call them, the four main features of Nutanix Era. And it's basically the idea of simplifying and making you more efficient in doing all of these things. So provisioning, we support multiple database engines. I know this is a SQL Server focused call, but when I was a DBA before I came to work for Nutanix in December, I was a DBA, and my shop before had a Nutanix, we had Oracle, we had MySQL, and MongoDB. Three of those four are currently managed with Nutanix Era, and if we'd have had something like Era, and I was actually looking at it before things changed at that company, it would have made our lives a lot simpler. And I would spend so much time doing cloning and patching. We had a large database for us, 5 or 7 to 8 terabyte database that we had to make a QA copy every month, and we would have probably done it more often if we had the bandwidth to do it. It just took so long to copy that backup over to the test environment and restore the backup there that it just wasn't time efficient to do it more often. And so these are things that Era can help you with. And as Mike showed you earlier, with that customer that got down to like 30 vCPUs, we had another customer who's a Nutanix Era customer that I believe they had something like, and they were a very large customer, had something like 250 different configurations of database servers out in their environment. And they use Nutanix Era to get down to a handful, I want to say under 12, of a combination of OS and database version. And Nutanix does that through the Nutanix, Nutanix Era does that with the software profilers that are built in there. It helps you do that version management. And if you have you already have your databases on Nutanix and you want to register them with Era, it will go out and you can do that. It will pull that database into Era. It will get all the information it needs. It will create a time machine. So the time machine is part of our snapshotting and our service level agreement to protect your database. And it will take that very first snapshot as soon as it's in there. And if you happen to have managing multiple clusters, as of the Era 2.0 release, you can then also register that cluster and make that a replication site. So it takes the realm of being, snapshots aren't backups because they stay on your same storage. Well, now we can say, hey, you know what, we can take that snapshot and send it over to another cluster. And now we're talking about, backup capability. And so the heart of the Era system are the profiles. We have 5 different profiles, and it's the way it's broken out is very nice because you can have a software profile, and kind of like that company talked about that went from like 300 down to a handful of configurations. You can make a software profile of your OS and your database version. So I've got a 2012 with a 2008 R2 server. I've got a 2012 with a 2012 SQL on it. I've got 2016 with 2012 SQL. You can manage all of those different combinations. Um, and you don't need to make a specific profile for a specific environment because we break out the network and compute and the domain, so that if you need to deploy a SQL server to, say, you have a test environment that you maybe have its own domain with its own network, and you don't want to give it, the 16 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM that you give your production environment, you can do that with the same profile that you would use to deploy that production environment. So that's how you maintain that like configuration. And like I said, those network profiles can be any network that is mapped into your Nutanix clusters. So if your Nutanix cluster has, multiple, networks, like most of them do, I know that my Nutanix cluster did. So if you can talk to that dev environment with a different IP, you can provision database servers into that. So next on the list here is our patching demo. So now I'm going to start my screen share here. What I was saying before is that we can now patch SQL Server, and we do that using the built-in software profiles that come with Nutanix Era that it uses for provisioning. So if I wanted to update a software profile that I've deployed databases from, it's a pretty easy process. In fact, I like this process better than some of the other patching ways we support. I would go in here and find this profile. So I already downloaded the cumulative update 6 for SQL 2019, but if I wanted to, I could create a new software profile, and I would just have to provide that local patch. So in my downloads folder here, I have a couple of the 2017 and the 2019 cumulative updates. And I would upload that to this server, and I would click create, and it would create me a new version of the software profile. I would give it a name, probably something like I did above, SQL 2019 cumulative update package 6. And then once you've created that, you would publish it. And when you publish it, as it says published here, it tells any server that was deployed from that software profile, hey, you've got an update. So how does that look to a server? So let's pop over here to our database servers. And I'm going to do my SQL 2019 because that's the one I've been talking about. And you can see here that we have an update available. And that happens the moment you press publish. And like I said, the great thing is anything that was published from that software profile gets that alert for an update available. And once again, trying to manage that combination of database OS, database patch level, trying to minimize the amount of configurations you're having to manage in the wild. And so to update it, obviously I just click update. If I had multiple different versions of updates, I could even choose what update I wanted to use. And then you can also choose to do it now or later. Now, obviously, would start that immediate. Later, you could pick a date. So if you knew you had a specific time and date that you needed to update that database software for maybe an outage window, you could put that in there and you could let it rip. It does ask you to put the database server name in here just to verify that you want to do this update. And I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I'm going to pop back real quick. So if this was a clustered server, I happen to have a SQL 2017 always on availability group cluster. And you can see here, it does have an update available. It would roll through these updates, keeping your database online. If you were to sit here on this screen, you would see it would start with this secondary ASIC replica first. It would turn this red, and then it would patch it. And then when it comes back online, it would go to probably one where the database isn't currently, and it would patch that. And then it would fail the database over, patch the last one, and it would be done. Like I said, in my previous life as a database admin, our patching was manual for our always availability on cluster because, we weren't comfortable letting, Windows automatically do it. And we weren't real comfortable with SCCM doing it for our main large production always on availability group because we didn't know how it would handle the failover. We weren't confident in the way the failover. Um, Here, once this starts patching, Era manages the failover. It manages where the database is, and it will keep that database online the whole time. So that's how patching does, and can really shrink that window down of time that you're using on patching, and kind of let you get back to doing stuff you want to do, right? And yeah, would have saved me a lot of time when I was a database administrator. So I'm going to pop back over here. I'll stop the screen share and we'll pop back over here to our slides. Maybe if we get a chance to do the other demo, we'll see if that patching is done. The other, I mentioned the time machine before. The time machine is the process that runs the backups. It takes the snapshots. It manages when the snapshots are taking. It manages when your log catch-up is done. So then if you have to do a restore, it will do tail log backups, anything to get you back to that moment that failure happened so you don't lose any data, because you know what? Nobody wants to lose data. The great thing about the time machine is it's a global time machine. So what that means is it will back up, wherever your database lives. So if it's a cluster, like I'm showing here in this diagram, so if it's a Nutanix cluster, it's online, the time machine is going to back up the primary database. With Microsoft SQL Server, when you provision it inside of Era, you can actually designate the server you want to back up. So if you wanted to back up it from the secondary, you can designate that. And it would back up that one. So when I say it's going to back up the primary server, I mean kind of the primary server you've designated to back up. So if a failure happens, because it's a global time machine, it will automatically switch over and start backing up from another available database. So if that Nutanix cluster went offline or just that VM went offline, it would automatically switch over and start backing up from that online cluster. And obviously, in failure, that's a great option. It's a wonderful option. You don't have to go in there and manually start backing up at your secondary site. I also think it's great for patching because for me, it always seemed like it was Murphy's Law that if something was going to go wrong, it was during patching. I have patched, 4-node FCI clusters, and while I'm patching another one, a physical server drops a disk or something, or something else happens, and now I'm down to only 2 nodes in my cluster, and now we're in emergency mode. And what's happening with our log backups? Maybe we're backing that up every 15 minutes. The way the time machine works, it would pop over and keep that backup schedule going. Once again, trying to minimize that data loss. And for database recovery options inside of Nutanix Era, you have multiple options. Obviously, you can do a side-by-side restore, which honestly was what I did most of the time as a DBA, which simply means I would restore that database as a new VM, or I could restore that database onto an existing VM that maybe even back to that same VM, and then just with a new name, obviously. And then I would just export the tables and data into my production database, and off we go. You do have the option to do a restore in place. So if you completely had a complete corrupt database, whatever the reason is, you could take a restore in place and overwrite that existing database. Again, though, the nice thing about this is it is going to be leveraging the Nutanix HCI snapshots, so that recovery should be relatively quick. If any of you on here happen to be Nutanix administrators, if you have done a restore from a protection plan on a Nutanix cluster on the storage side, it will restore a VM almost instantaneous. And that's what your snapshots will be inside of Era. It will restore that very quickly. It takes a few more minutes there, because then it will register it with the database, register it with Era, so you can track that database. And then you have those options to do those two above side by side to restore in place from any point in time that you have taken a backup. And like I said, the cool thing is about all of our database that are supported by Nutanix Era, not just SQL Server, um, if it needs to, you know, if it can still read logs from that database server that's offline or that database is offline, it will try to do a last log backup before it does that restore. Once again, trying to minimize that data loss. So what's it look like to recover a database? Well, I'm going to kind of do this, do as a double duty. Nutanix Era has the ability now to say, hey, if you have a different version of a Nutanix database, so say in my case here, I happen to have a 2008 R2 server database running on a 2012 server, and you want to move that to a new you want to move that to a 2019 server. Can you do that? Yes, you can do that. So we're going to take a look at it. Here's my Fiesta DB here. It is running on 2008 R2. I've got a time machine running here. And so we're going to click into this time machine. And we're going to come in here and we're going to check here. You can authorize the database server VMs you want to restore to. I already have put this in here. And this kind of can also be used as a security thing. So if you're a super admin inside of Era, you can only see the databases and servers that you've created or registered. And it is running on 2008 R2. And what I was talking about before Mike reminded me that I wasn't sharing my database was this authorized database server VM. So you can decide which VMs you can restore this database server to. So if you were the main database admin and maybe your people who were also using Nutanix Era didn't have full access to all the servers, you could actually say, hey, you can restore this to my server. And this is going to be expanded as we expand the RBAC offerings that are inside of Nutanix Era. So I'm going to go ahead and create a clone of this database. And I'm going to choose just the latest for right now. And under here, I'm going to choose used authorized server. So here's my SQL 2019 dev server. It's actually the one I patched. We're going to go ahead and say next. And I'm just going to call this Fiesta test because maybe I'm testing this to see if it'll run on 2019. I'm going to hit clone. And when it's doing this, it's going to attach a drive to that server. Let's restore the snapshot from the Nutanix HCI snapshot. It's going to attach that drive to that server, and then it's going to copy that data over. Now, when it's done with that, it will still be running compatibility mode. So it's still going to be running in the 2008 compatibility mode. And as of now, it won't have all of the Nutanix best practices provided. And so somebody might say, well, what's the point of doing this? Well, part of it is it gets you off a 2008 R2 database server that's is either no longer supported or won't be very shortly. But also, once you get it to this point, you can make another clone of this, and then it will be then you can deploy it with all those Nutanix best practices. So it kind of becomes a two-step thing. There are plans in the future to when you do this, if it doesn't already have Nutanix best practices, it will apply those Nutanix best practices. That is something that is on our roadmap. While this is cloning, we can look at the patching here, and this took 4 minutes. Now, to be honest, this was obviously not a large database server and was literally stood up yesterday. So your mileage may vary, but it will patch quickly because when doing patching, it's doing the same thing. It's going to attach a disk with that cumulative update files, and it's going to run the SQL patcher to do all those updates. So there we go. We did just restore our clone database here. So we took this database, it restored it in a minute and 23 seconds, and it dropped it onto our 2019 server. So if I click on Fiesta DB test now, I will see our database version. And actually, I have it here in my console here. If I do a refresh, I should see my database. And there it is. And like I said, it will still be running in compatibility mode for SQL Server 2008. So you could, if you wanted to, obviously switch it to, the current version if you wanted to test it. But it's a good way to get you off of those 2008 servers as they are hitting end of support. And by the way, though, I should say that's not just a 2019 or a 2008 thing. If you have a 2012 database server, you can do the same thing. You can restore it onto a 2019 server. So, Nutanix Era will help you manage that process of getting from multiple database conversions, maybe down to just a few. And like I said, if you're using Nutanix Era to do all of your deployments, all of your cloning, all of that will be tracked in here. I mean, like we have an easy dashboard here that shows you how many sources, how many clones. It shows you any space savings. Obviously, that Fiesta database was not very big. So it's not showing you a whole lot. But one of the problems we had when I showed up at my last job was they had been through a lot of different IT people, and they had lost complete track of where databases were. We were constantly finding SQL Server databases that were spun up, using a license that we had no idea if they were there. And even worse, some of them we weren't 100% sure we could shut off. And sometimes we did shut them off to see who screamed, because that was the only way to figure out who owned them, because we were dealing with a multi-national company, rather relatively large, but it was spread out across the world. So it wasn't always easy to know who owned those databases. So that's some of the advantages that this product brings you. And as I said, it doesn't just do it for SQL Server, it'll do it for these databases here. And the processes are all the similar: deploying, patching, creating software profiles. All of that is a similar process no matter what the database thing. So if you're a Microsoft SQL Server and someone drops a Postgres server in your lap, we come with an out-of-the-box software profile that comes with Era. That if you need to deploy a Postgres SQL Server or even a Postgres HA cluster, you can do that right here in just a few steps and just a few clicks. And you may not even be a Linux person, and you can probably get this stood up with very little help. So that's just not, is the power of Era is great what it does for Microsoft SQL admins, and we were really looking at this product for that. But also, it can let you do more. And like I always say, I'd rather be doing stuff like figuring out how to make my databases run at optimal speed, figuring out how to help the business do more, and maybe being more proactive. And in my mind, Era is one of those products that help you do that. Alrighty, so I am done with my screen share. So that's Nutanix Era and how Nutanix helps you on databases. Mike, do you have anything to follow up with?
No, no, great demo, David. And yeah, hopefully that gives everyone a good overview of the ways in which Nutanix can help you power up your SQL Server database across, HCI as a platform, security or networking, self-service, and database as a service as a part of Era. So I really appreciate your attention and your time.
Excellent. Really cool demo, David. Really great presentation, Mike. I know those demos take a little bit of extra
Thanks a
time,
lot.
and yeah, they're a little higher risk, but thank you for doing that. I think it helps us to visualize the power of what Nutanix Era can do, just so much more. So we do have some questions coming in for you from the audience. The first question I see here on the screen, they're asking, does this help with SQL indexing in any way? Is there some way to help make that more efficient or better through using Nutanix Era?
Well, you could certainly test the result. It would help you test the results of
Yep.
indexing, because
I was going to say, I would think that just the I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I think we're going the same directions, because you could take a snapshot of all the file groups that represent, the databases and indexes. You can instantiate it on a test and development instance. And a lot of times you're re-indexing for a particular reason. Maybe you suspect there's some kind of fragmentation, or you're wondering if that might improve a query response time, or maybe you just want to see if you're going to save some space, perhaps. So that's, so then you could test ahead of time. Era could certainly help you do that. It could give you a separate copy on which to run it on a separate node. And again, with data locality, have it give minimum impact to the overall platform when you run that testing. But David, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that some of the just the inherent capabilities in Nutanix cluster itself bring would help with indexing the way I was thinking, just the data locality, or in the case of the volume groups to help you if you need to pull in more horsepower. I think those would be things that could help you as well too.
Yeah, so we actually have customers that will say if you're using a single data file today associated with the database and you want to spread it across multiple data files, which gives you more concurrency in some cases and perhaps better performance. Reindexing is a way you can actually spread the load across, depending on if you're using clustered indexes or non-clustered indexes, there's various ways to move the data, based on proportional fill within those database files. But reindexing is one way to do it. And that would, in some cases, if your single data file today, could help with performance, and then you get kind of better throughput and IOPS out of the system as well.
Excellent. Yeah, great answers. There's another question. Is it possible to implement this in a multi-tenant environment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways, especially if you want to start giving DBAs or
I think
maybe.
that's coming for Nutanix Era. That has been a request. Go ahead, Mike. I didn't.
No worries at all. I mean, so multi-tenancy and multi-tenant can mean different things. But Era has the capability to assign roles to people. So if you wanted to give someone access to specific databases to which they could make copies, that could be a way to give a tenant control over when they decide to refresh or even create automatic refresh cycles for databases. We also have a layered application called Nutanix Com, which can develop a marketplace. So if you wanted to publish specific blueprints, that could then call Era to deploy databases and choose which tenants you deploy those that marketplace to, what they'd have access to, what versions of SQL, whether they want to patch their database, whether they want to scale a given application. Com gives you ways in which to do that and give ownership to the end users. So those two ways in which we can give you kind of a multi-tenant or a end user focused environment.
Awesome. And I know we're almost out of time here. Just real quickly, I wanted to ask this one. Is it possible to migrate SQL virtual machines from other platforms into Nutanix Era?
Yeah, and that one I leave to David because I think that's another one of his areas of expertise with Move.
So yes, there are multiple ways. We do have a product called Nutanix Move that you can use. I will say that it's probably not recommended for large database implementations. I will say I have done it when I was a customer for a small, not super critical database VM to go from, say, another hypervisor to AHV. You could also do something if you already had, like, say, a physical FCI cluster. You could extend that multiple ways by using, like Mike said, using Nutanix volumes, or even people I know have taken it availability groups and wrapped them around that cluster, and then they fill the database over to that availability group that's running on Nutanix. And then honestly, the other simple way is honestly just stand up a Nutanix with Nutanix Era, in which you'll stand up with all your best practices, and then you can just do a backup restore. Because I believe even if you do the FCI with availability group, there is an outage window there. But the good thing is if you were to deploy that first with the Nutanix Era, that database server would be deployed with those Nutanix best practices.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, it looks like we've reached the top of the hour here, running out of time. Before we go, I do want to announce the winner of our Visa $300 gift card. This is going to Scott Fast from North Carolina. We'll reach out to you to deliver that prize. And of course, I want to remind everyone to watch your email inbox for an invite to the upcoming sessions in this series. We've got 2 more sessions, with the next one being on October 14th, talking about the total transformation with 2 more experts from Nutanix. Don't miss that one. And then finally, after that, we'll talk about the WePro Nutanix Factor. Make sure that you join that one on October 28th. Mike and David, really excellent having you on today. Thank you for taking time to do a live demo. Really cool stuff. And of course, thank you to our audience out there for joining us. Don't forget about the Nutanix Era test drive link that's there in your handouts tab, where you can try out Nutanix Era for yourself for free in your web browser. So don't forget to click on that link before you go. Thank you to Nutanix for supporting this event, and thank you everyone out there in our audience for joining us. I hope that you learned a lot, and have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.